I wanted to get some stories from you, various tales from your childhood.
Okay. We lived in a little town called Wishram. That we moved from Wishram to Portland when I was a little over 5 years old. It was that first few years of my school life was very disconnected and disjointed, and it was very difficult to feel connected to people. I had friends in each of those schools, but it was hard to feel really established. We moved again, and that's when we moved to the house that we stayed in for the neighborhood we stayed in for quite a while. My parents divorced in 1971 was when they separated, and divorced in 1972. We were still in the house at that time. And without going into a lot of detail, my mom had issues. My mom was the one who asked for the divorce. She had problems with alcohol. Looking back, it's very likely, although it was never diagnosed, wasn't even really a common diagnosis, but she was probably bipolar. Later in the fall of 1972, they kind of reached a breaking point. There was an incident that was a breaking point for my older sister, Kathy, and I. And through a series of events in the next couple of days, we ended up going to live with my dad. And it was about a year later, through another series of very dramatic events, that Carla, Corey, and Scott came to live with us. And so now we're all with Dad. And so we went in and got things ready and stuff and moved back into that house. So I finished my junior year and my senior year back in that house that I had been in for junior high, basically, in the start of high school. So we were away from there for like a couple years and then moved back in. Well, welcome to Coffee Breaks with Steve, and a slightly different introduction and opening this morning than what we usually do, but we wanted to kind of follow up on last week's episode and make sure that we were bringing everybody up to speed. If you were here last week, you know that we had part one of Chelan asking me questions about my childhood and me sharing some information about the story of my life. And it was a long enough conversation that we decided to stretch it out into part two. And you'll see that her name is showing up here on the screen. She'll be with me in a couple of moments to continue the conversation. But again, welcome to Coffee Breaks with Steve. I am Steve Glavin, and this is the show where we come together around our virtual coffee table each week and join the conversation to chat about interesting topics with amazing guests. And if you are joining us for the first time today, welcome. If you've been with us before, welcome back. Yeah, we're going to get into some things right away, just so we make sure that we are staying on track with this. But first, since Chelan's not down here yet, I'll say everybody drink. And I want to say good morning to Carla, good morning to Jerry, good morning to Rick. I know some of you on here and some of you, again, who were on here last week are either members of my family or in some cases people who have been a part of my story directly or indirectly for many, many years. Maybe we went to school together, maybe our paths crossed at different times, but we're going to be talking about kind of continuing the story and talking about things, some of which have to do with the latter part of my childhood, if you will, the teenage years, although we barely got into that. Well, we're going to be talking about a few things here. Anyway, before we get into that, let's share some sweet and savory. You know, it's been fun this last week because family is in town. Grandsons came into town last weekend and at the first of the week, and then more and more family poured in over the course of the last few days. And so we've been having fun. This last week when grandsons Remy, Jameson, and Nicholas got into town, we've been trying to find some fun activities, as we'll be continuing to do. But one of the things that came up last year that we wanted to continue to do and follow up on this year was an escape room. And so we did have an opportunity this last week with the boys to go to an escape room here in Spokane Valley area. We actually beat the room with like barely over 2 minutes to spare, and exercising the option to utilize hints. But it was a lot of fun. The boys had a great time. Remy and Jameson had done an escape room with us last summer. This was Nicholas's first time, but it was great. And then I don't know if I put any pictures of this up, but we also did something yesterday that was a repeat of last year, and that is that Remy, coming off of doing the formal escape room last summer, decided that it would be a lot of fun to create his own escape room for family members to try at our home, in our basement, in one of the rooms. And so he did that again this year, and we did that yesterday, and several family members participated. And as I say, I don't think I grabbed any pictures of that, but I will just tell you he did a great job. Congratulations, and well done, Remy, and congratulations to everyone who participated in it, all the family. It's always a lot of fun when we have activities and do things that bring the family together. We did yesterday, that's a nice warped picture. We did yesterday take advantage of the 4th of July and go to a baseball game. The people really were not that distorted at the baseball game. They were actually more normal looking. Don't know how these pictures are going to look, but yeah, they're all going to be a little bit weird. Those are actually family members, not distorted, warped people. It's interesting how that worked out. And there were fireworks. We'll skim past that. I also want to share some birthdays this week. I do want to know in the comments if you'd like to share your own. Oh, hi, Kathy. Kathy Garlic, big sister, is here. Good. I'm glad we have family members here, by the way, because I mentioned this last week. There are things that may be part of my memories that my siblings or others who were part of those eras may have different memories about. My siblings may say, I don't think you're quite right. This is exactly how I remember that going, or partially how I remember that going. But I welcome their being here and being able to speak into the stories. Christina Crick has a birthday today. Christina is the executive director of the Sabre 6 Foundation. Many of you know that's an organization that I am involved with, supporting veterans. And just want to wish Christina a happy birthday today as she is celebrating. And then this next week, Amy has a birthday. And Amy is a pseudo member of our family and celebrating a birthday on the 11th. So we want to wish Amy a very, very happy birthday as she celebrates this week as well. Do you have a special day this week that perhaps got missed in my browsing through and trying to look to see what was all on the calendar in the midst of family being here and doing escape rooms, baseball games, fireworks, the various other things that we're doing? Well, if that's the case, and you have a special day, perhaps it's a birthday, a graduation, a wedding ceremony, an actual wedding, somebody got married this week. Maybe you had a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, baptismal ceremony at wherever you are. Put that in the chat so we can celebrate with you. And if you have a special day coming up through the remainder of this month or the course of this year at any point, and you want to make sure that we do know about it, get it on our calendar so that we can celebrate with you at the proper time, you can send us an email at cbwsteve@comcast.net. You see it there on your screen. Jot that down. It's the email address we use for so many things. And we would like to be able to acknowledge and celebrate with you. So do give us that opportunity if you would like to. All right, listen, we're going to be getting into our topic here. And so I want to provide an opportunity for my guest co-host to come in and join the conversation. And we're going to get things reset just a little bit here as Chelan wanders in. Chelan, if you can.
I was very busy. I was getting ready and to look my best.
As you always do under these circumstances. So we certainly appreciate that. And just want to welcome you once again to Coffee Breaks with Steve.
I had a banana. I dropped it.
Do you want to get it?
No, we're fine. Everything's good.
She'll be here. She'll be back in a moment. It's not a big deal.
I'm very put together today. Everything's fine.
Yeah. So you're here. You're actually taller than I am. Did you put a pillow under you?
No.
Part of it is your hair.
Always the hair, but also I'm Chris and I both have this thing where we're the same height when we're seated.
Yeah.
And then when he stands up, he's got it all in the legs. I'm all torso.
Your mom and I have the same thing, is that her legs are, she's tall, a little bit taller. She's always been a little bit taller than I am, although I don't know, we're getting older. We're both shrinking, I think.
Bummer.
But I know. But it's when we're standing next to each other, I think she's still taller. And when we sit down, we're about the same height. It's always been that case because it's her legs that are longer than mine. Legs. And Rick says you look very cute. Carla says you look fabulous.
Thank you.
And I say, I would say both are true, and I'm glad to have you here. So you're here in person this week. Oftentimes when you join as a guest or a co-host, you are at your home in Yakima, Washington.
Yes.
And we're on separate screens. So today you are among the family members.
I'm amongst.
You are among, and you're here too. So what were, as we consider what we talked about, what you saw last week, what are some of the things that stand out to you that were maybe new information, or it was something that added an element that you weren't aware of previously? I remember you mentioning during the show that you were surprised. It was sort of a revelation to you to think about the fact that the Wishram portion of my childhood was only until age 5, that you in your mind sort of thought, my whole childhood was spent in Wishram.
Yeah. That just the timeline of events. And even though I know, like, even the order of birth for your siblings, hearing about it, and my sister Carla was born, and then Scott was, it's like, you were already this far into your life when these things happen. And I'm the baby of the family, of the Glavin, in this family. So I haven't had that experience of, and then another sibling showed up. So that, just getting that perspective of how interesting, how weird that would be to be this age and now a new one, like just those kinds of things. And also the historical events, like where you were in your life.
I was kind of like Forrest Gump, and Forrest Gump, how he's always there for those. I'm probably not interacting as directly, but I kind of feel like Forrest Gump.
Were you ever a shrimp fisherman?
I don't want to get too far ahead on the story.
Okay. All right.
So, but you also mentioned that one of the things that surprised you, or at least that you brought up last week, was how many times before I got to like 3rd grade, how many times we moved and how many different schools Kathy and I were in during that period of time. She had even more because she started school in Wishram up until the beginning of 2nd grade before we moved.
Yeah. That blows my mind, as well as just the family dynamics. Like, I knew some of them.
Yeah.
Mom was always
this is why I need my siblings in here,
But even just understanding the dynamics with where Grandpa was when he took you all in, when you were like, we're done being at Mom's, we're good. Like, just that level of showing up, opened a whole new level of understanding and respect for Grandpa that I never knew.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get on with the conversation, talk about some more things that you brought up and that we talked about, and hopefully some of this will be interesting. But again, I want to really invite our viewers, those of you who have a direct or indirect connection to my story, my family, feel free to put your own perspectives and memories in the chat. But also, we're going to be continuing to talk about things that others may have experienced in their own way, just whether it's historical events or things that went on over the course of those years. And so we welcome you being a part of it. And we're just going to go ahead now and launch that conversation. Maybe running into one of those issues where the video doesn't want to load. So we're going to try this again. And hopefully not have, again, we test these things beforehand, Chelan.
Yep, I definitely do.
Let's see what happens here. So we're going to work on this for a minute, as we often find ourselves doing. But while we're doing that, Chelan,
Yeah.
I'm just curious about some of the things that you mentioned at the end of this,
Yeah.
which hopefully will be running here momentarily. The fact that there were some additional things you want to follow up on,
Yes.
and I'm wondering if any of that has to do with, you
Uh,
know,
I-
other aspects of my childhood, or
Yes, and so I know that there are things we didn't even begin to get into, especially historical events. And we got into some of them, but we barely scratched the surface. And
right.
you are, if I could describe you with one word to people who don't know you, you are a storyteller.
Yeah.
So uh, the next word would be weird.
Okay.
But storyteller and weird are the two top. And so the ability to dive into your perspective of
Yes.
things, and like you talked about, we didn't even get into MLK Jr. getting assassinated, and
Our Robert Kennedy, which
Robert
were all sort of parts of
Kennedy.
that same
Yeah.
era.
And I know we barely scratched the surface of even your I think it's not in the video, I don't think. It was after we taped that we were talking about how your high school became a McMenamins, and about the various teachers at, was it Adams High School?
There were which part of the various
Well,
teachers?
and the fact that who's painted on the barrel, the white, she's
Oh, that
painted
was
on
at
the barrel.
elementary school.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Yes, at Kennedy McMenamins, that there were some things that we didn't really get a chance to talk about until later, and
Yeah.
so
It's just there's a wealth of things that I feel like it could be an entire TV show to dive into your life.
Well, we're going to try a different approach to sharing this video, and hopefully it works. And I may even ask you to check at the other side and
I
see if
might.
this is working in a moment. But we're going to try this and share a tab and say, all right, we're trying to do this in a way that's going to work, and we're going to see if it does in a moment.
Let's see.
Because I think if I do it this way, it may actually not. We're not going to be able to share not going to be able to share the audio if I do it that way. We're just trying different things here, folks, and hopefully going to make this work. If not, we're just going to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
It's a bit bizarre when this happens, but we'll see what we get here. All right, so I'm getting the impression, Chelan, that our poor video is not going to load up today. We're going to have
Aren't
one
you
of those
lucky
events.
I'm here?
I'm absolutely lucky that you're here.
Yeah.
And can converse on this with me. But one of the things that we talked about in the video last week that we'll revisit is the fact that you talked to me, you were asking me some questions about things that inventions, if you will, or different things that I remembered as changes in technology. And some of the things that I recall we discussed were like the phone systems. And again, Kathy may have some memories about this from Wishram days, that I think when I was very young and we were in Wishram, we were still on something that was called a party line. It was a system where you still had to have live operators, and to contact several people were actually on the same phone line. It was like having a phone extension, but between houses. And you would know if somebody was calling you by the number and the pattern of rings. There was a certain ring pattern that meant that it was you who were supposed to pick up the phone. Now, the reality was, with a party line, anybody could pick up the phone.
How often did you guys pick up the phone and listen in on your neighbors' conversations?
I mean, Kathy may have a greater memory than that, because we weren't on the phone. We weren't allowed to answer the phone, be on the phone. It was mom and dad's responsibility to answer the phone. And I believe, and again, Kathy or others who are old enough to remember party lines more specifically I'm not saying, Kathy, I'm not saying you're old. I'm just saying you may have more memories about this part of our lives than Wishram. But in making a call, that you would pick up the phone, and I think you could direct dial. But again, somebody else on the party line could pick up and hear that you were using the phone, and they'd hang up, I guess. But Kathy says we were too little, and that's pretty much true. But there were also still live operators. So you reached a point where you could dial a direct number, but you could also dial operator and say, operator, would you connect me with, and you would provide the number and they could do it. Now, it got really weird, I guess, if you were on a party line with other households near you and you wanted to call one of those neighbors, right? You would tell the operator you wanted to call that person, and then they would do the ring pattern for that person's home, I guess. But it was just kind of weird. The whole party line thing was kind of a weird segment of time.
Okay, so it went from party, and there was a game, right? Wasn't there a game of like, it had to do with the party line, like
are you talking about pranking or
no, it was a girls game, mystery date or something like that, or like one of those party
there were
games.
Like you could do, like, I guess I'm sure there were games. There were also people would do prank calls using the telephone. I mean, that went back quite a ways.
Is there a refrigerator running?
But another thing, and then we eventually got, by the way, you also had these typically
everybody drink.
Typically,
I already did mine. I'll do that.
Phones were not fancy in any way. You either had a wall phone, and you've seen the old pictures of having the earpiece and you spoke into the thing on the wall.
I'm sorry, was that?
No.
That was
to my best recollection.
That's like 1930s, right?
Oh, Kathy's saying that the railroad station was on the same party line. That had to have been interesting because they got a lot of business calls.
Just constant ringing at your house, but it's not for you.
Not for us, because different pattern. You just ignore it. And the bells on the phones tended to be pretty loud. They were ringy phones. But another thing was that they were very plain looking, typically black phones that sat on a table. You could have a wall phone. And by the time I was little, you didn't have the separate, like you see in the old movies, where you had the little earpiece you held up to your ear and you spoke into the little speaker on the wall. It was more, you had what looks like what we think of as phones,
right?
That had the receiver, that had the earpiece and the mouthpiece and the same thing. But they were typically black. They were bulky. They weren't fancy or designed to add to the look and feel of your home. That came later when you had designs and you had different colors. In the 60s, they were starting to do that as an incentive.
Sure.
But they were also rotary dial phones. And rotary dial phones, which were still part of an analog phone system, were still around in many places until into the 70s.
Well, I thought that we had a rotary style phone at one point.
I don't know that we did. By that time, most of the systems were moving to digital. You may have had one that you played with.
Maybe. I remember using a rotary phone at some
point. But
we
all, by the time we were in the late 60s, I think maybe, and Kathy, again, you might remember, our table phone was beige, she said. Okay, so they weren't all black. But when we moved into the second house that we moved into on Northeast 31st, you'll recall from last week, we lived in one house there and then we moved across the street
during a snowstorm.
Yeah. And I don't know, it may have been in the first house, but I know in the second house, in our kitchen, we had a wall phone that sat kind of mid kitchen, and it had a really long coiled cord to and that was typical because then you could walk around with it. It was before they had the wireless phones, but you could walk around with the, handset. And we used to, by the time we were teenagers, if we wanted to have a private conversation with a friend or a boyfriend or girlfriend, our door that started down to the back door and then the basement, the back landing, and then the basement was off the kitchen. And you could stretch it far enough to get onto that landing and shut the door. And so, sit there.
But did it matter because somebody else from another house could
No. Because by now, when we're in Portland, we're no longer.
The railroad is listening.
No, we're no longer on a party line. This is now in Portland, slightly more modern times, about 10 years later. And we do have a private phone number now, and nobody else is listening in. But I remember push button phone, the being able to do what they called the touch tone. That was cool. Some of them, once you got to that point, had the touch tone in the handset.
Oh,
And,
yes.
you know,
Oh,
you're starting
yeah,
to come up with now
yeah.
pastel colors and different colors that
Hamburger
you could get.
phones.
Yeah, you were starting to get also some of those special, uniquely designed phones.
Unique
But
phones.
phones weren't the only things that changed over that time. I mean, again, I can remember this is well into adulthood, and you kids were little when we got our first cell phone, and the
Right.
coverage was very limited. But you know, just the idea of having, even getting to the point which may have been around when I was still a kid, I don't recall. I remember still having to have the handset attached to the phone in some way. But when we got to the wireless, you know, where you could walk around separately with the handset, but I think that was later. But we also, television was different.
Yeah.
We had a black and white TV till, and again, Kathy or Carla, well into the 60s, maybe late 60s. And I remember in Wishram, because you remember my mentioning some things like remembering my parents being in the living room while my parents were watching one of the Kennedy Nixon debates in 1960, and that was on our old black and white TV. And we had our setup. I remember in Wishram, there was this sort of wire metal stand, and our television sat on one part of it, a little bit lower, and then there was a higher level to it where the phonograph sat, and where we played our LPs. And then the rack underneath, next to the TV, but underneath the phonograph, was where all the records were kept. And Jerry Thompson mentioning phone with a long curly cord in her basement.
Yeah.
He still has a landline.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's the other thing, is a lot of people don't even have landlines anymore. But I mean, that remained common for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But we had a black and white TV, or different black and white TVs, for many, many years. And I remember my grandma and grandpa Sparks, I think, were among the ones that I remember first in the family having a color TV. And it was really fun to go over and spend the weekend at grandma and grandpa's, because we could watch our Saturday morning cartoons in color. And grandma tended to have the colors turned up really hot. So, I mean, it was almost neon watching those, but it was so cool to see that. And that was the other thing, is that Saturday, you didn't get cartoons every day of the week on a specific channel. We had, when I was growing up in Portland, we had like 5 channels period that you could get. There was channel 2, which was KATU, it was the ABC affiliate. Channel 6, KOIN, it was the CBS affiliate. Channel 8, KGW, which was the NBC affiliate. Channel 10, which was,
I remember this,
PBS. I mean, we still have those channels. You can still get those channels in Portland. It's just now they are among the dozens that you can get through cable. But we didn't have cable in Portland. We had cable in Wishram because the location in the gorge, you couldn't get good reception via antenna. And so you had cable TV. We had cable TV.
Here are the things that I have questions about, though.
Yeah.
You were so little. How do you remember these things?
The Wishram part, or in general?
Well, just like, we didn't have cable. We had to go through because of this process.
Did have cable.
Well, you did have cable because we had to go through but we couldn't in Portland because of this, that, and the other.
Several reasons that I remember that. And again, you come back to certain things that get talked about. Kathy remembers more of our, of getting cable. I mean, she and I have talked about this, so that continues to spark the memories.
Okay.
But there were also shows that we got in Wishram that came from Seattle stations, because we were in Washington State. We got both Portland and Seattle via our cable. So there were kid shows that Carlos says Stephen remembers everything. But that we got only because we were on cable and getting those channels as well. And we lost that when we moved to Portland. We could only get the Portland stations. But in Portland, we got it all via antenna. And you either had an antenna mounted on top of your house, or you had what were often called rabbit ears that sat on your TV, and you'd have to adjust them, move them around. Sometimes you could switch channeling and stuff. And the reception could vary based on the weather and a variety of other things. But then we had Channel 10, which was PBS, and Channel 12, which was an independent local station. I think Channel 12 at the very beginning was tied to the ABC affiliate, and then Channel 2 started, ABC moved over there. Channel 12, KPTV, was just an independent local station that ran a lot of local programming. And they did do things like afternoon cartoons and some of the kid shows, but the other stations did too. You were going to say something.
Oh, I swear I have a memory, and maybe this is just like we had one of those old TVs, and it may have been just like when you were a bachelor, you got a personal tiny TV that was black and white with rabbit ears. I remember that being in my bedroom and trying to watch this grainy old, this big of a screen TV. And like,
right. And that may have been, I think I may still have had the TV that I was given as a graduation from high school gift by my dad. It was a little 12-inch black and white that I took to college with me. And then when I came home, that was the first TV that your mom and I actually had in our apartment. We didn't have anything else besides that for several years at least.
Oh my goodness.
But so color TV, Kathy, I think Kathy, is what I remember too, is the first color TV was in the second house that we were in on Northeast 31st. And Kathy, do you remember, I don't recall that being a brand new TV. Somehow I remember that like Grandma and Grandpa Glavin replaced, well, by that point, I think Grandpa died. Grandpa Glavin had passed away a year or two before then, and Grandma may have replaced her color TV, and we got the one that had been in her living room that was a color TV. But I may be misremembering that one in spite of what Carla says. But I agree with Kathy. I think the first color TV was in that second house. The other thing that was funny was the old TVs. I remember especially with the black and white TVs. This was before you had a lot of solid state circuitry. And so the TVs you would open the back if the TV was starting to get like snowy or glitchy or it was rolling, and you could try to control that with knobs. There were all these knobs to try to correct vertical and horizontal roll, and if it was too snowy, you'd adjust the antennas. There was this whole process. That was outer limits, right?
Limits,
But you had those things, and so if it was really glitching, or sometimes all of a sudden the picture would collapse, and you knew there was something wrong, you would unplug the TV. My dad would take off the back of the TV, and there were all these glass vacuum tubes that were the circuitry. That was the electronics. And they were all different sizes, and they had a different serial number on them. And you would gather up all your glass tubes, and you would take them to places like Fred Meyer and other stores had these consoles where you would plug in the tubes at various spots and test them. And it would tell you if they were still working or bad, kind of like, now you can test batteries and stuff. And then underneath the console, there was a cabinet that opened, and you would find in little boxes, they would have the numbers on them, and you could then purchase the replacement tube or tubes that you needed, go back to your house, stick them in the right spots in the back of your TV, close up the TV, turn your TV on, and everything would be running again the way it was supposed to. We also didn't have remote controls for the TVs.
Right, you got up.
You had to go up and do everything.
And switch.
Dial. You had to turn channels that had the numbers on.
That's right.
Eventually, the first remote controls that came out weren't these electronic ones. They were actually like these push button click things, and they only had like you had on, off, and maybe change channels, but it was just you're changing channels up or down. You didn't get to select the channel on the number, and maybe volume. It may have had volume control. I don't recall, but that was a big deal too.
Yeah.
But there was television. There were telephones. What else? I'm trying to think about some of the other.
Well, so I actually had questions about, because I get confused about the music. So 8-track versus like what were you, cassette and the vinyl, and when that became, and
I remember Kathy, because she was a couple of years older, it was a big deal. I mean, we had growing up, it was just vinyl. We just had vinyl. And there were, Mom and Dad typically had what were called 33 1/3 LPs, which we still have 33 1/3 LPs. And they were the big ones, the bigger discs. Right. There were also some, though, of those discs back then that were 78. They ran at a faster, they were just recorded differently. But there were 78s, there were 33 1/3. There was even a setting on the record player for 16, which was like half speed. But I don't recall having records there. It was just fun sometimes to put your records on and either speed them up and they sounded like chipmunks, or slow them down and get the slow-mo effect from running them at a slower speed, which probably wasn't good for the records. But we had our own little phonograph in our room in Wishram. And I think even, Kathy and Carla shared rooms during a lot of our time in the early days of Portland, before we moved into houses that were big enough for each to have a room.
Was there any tech at the time for you to be able to record yourself?
Oh, yeah. So I remember, again, in the early to mid 60s, like going over to my uncle's house, and he had a little reel-to-reel. I mean, there were reel-to-reel tape recorders, but you could then start to get in the 60s these smaller portable reel-to-reel recorders that had a little button microphone. And for my Kathy says the 78s were on their way out. And I think that's right. But I still remember, I think our parents having the 16s, and we had a lot of 33 and the thirds. Also, the smaller singles were always 45s. They had a bigger hole, and you had to put a converter over the spindle to get those to set on there because the hole in the middle was bigger.
These are the things I've never understood. Yeah.
And so going to the recorders, for my 12th birthday, 1968, one of my birthday gifts was one of those little reel-to-reel recorders with the button microphone. And Kathy and I, particularly Carla, sometimes we had so much fun. We would record. We made up characters.
Is that Snyder and Murphy are
Snyder
characters?
and Murphy were characters that we did.
I have never heard this.
And from there, eventually, Kathy, was that also where we started doing ultimately the little voices that we did? Snyder and Murphy, I don't recall necessarily had our little chipmunk style voices that Kathy and I could both do that I'm not going to demonstrate here. No, I can still do it, but I'm not going to demonstrate it. But 78s. Okay, so Fats Don, look at Rick talking about having some 78s. Jerry says, don't forget 45s. We talked about that a little bit. Kathy was the first one in our family that I remember getting 45s when she was reaching her preteen years. There were some groups out that she liked. And I remember probably Kathy around 1965 or so, you starting to get records as like birthday gifts, and some were 45 singles. She had a couple of.
Do you remember your first one? I want to see it in the comments.
I'm going to guess, Kathy, and see if you remember. One of your first 45s was the Bee Gees' Holiday. Ooh, you're a holiday. Did you have that one, Kathy? And is that one of your first ones that you had? I have a recollection of that. I could be wrong. There was also one of Kathy's first. Yeah. Okay. One of her first 33 and a thirds. I'm trying to remember. And the Cavaliers, something in the Cavaliers. It was the one that did. I'm trying to remember now the single that was the big deal on that one. Kathy's going to remember the name. J. Frank Wilson and the Cavaliers. And this was the single that made the LP famous, was the one about, it was one about somebody driving a car and getting in an accident. There's a 45 Incense and Peppermints. Yes. And we could easily find Incense and Peppermints. That was sort of I remember it had the chord organ in it. It had the rock organ as part of the instrumental on that. Yeah. So what are you guys, while we're talking about this, what are the first records that you remember getting, particularly in your teenage years, when you thought it was cool to have 45s or LPs?
And I will say I do remember, because you still have records. Mm-hmm. Do you still have the record player?
We don't have an old one, but I have a record player right out here that plays the LP.
And I remember growing up and listening to some of your records, and we would listen to the Disneyland one with the Main Street Electrical Parade.
Okay.
We would listen to comedy ones like Steve Martin.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure there were things like the Carpenters and stuff that you would play every now
and
again.
We still have those. I still have some of the ones that were either part of my growing up or particularly my teenage years, and also some that I think I inherited that were some of my dad's, or at least part of my parents' collection. But covering a few more things in the little time we have left here. Yes, records. You talked about tapes. Later on, by the late 60s, early 70s, you were starting to see the cassette tapes. 8 tracks were also out early and around that time. And they were a bigger cassette. The smaller cassettes were actually much more convenient. And that's, some people had 8-track players in their car for quite a while, but the 8-track tape cartridges are what they call those, were big.
8-track or 8-track?
8-track. And I think it was because they had 8 different
spools.
Well, they had one spool, but you could play like I don't know why they called them 8-track. Some of you may remember this and be able to fill it in. Google why it was called an 8-track.
We could Google it.
Cassettes were smaller, and they typically were like a single album, the equivalent of an LP vinyl record. And you could get either. For a long time, you could get either. And the cassettes were easier to do things like play in the car. You had cassette players coming out in the cars by then. Or when they started to come out with things like Walkman, the first Walkman were cassette playing that you could wear on your belt or have in a portable.
When-ish was that?
That had to be sometime in the mid to late 70s.
Because that's Walkman for me. That was a thing in the 90s.
By then you were starting to move from even cassettes to the CDs, and then ultimately we went to the MP3s and stuff. I mean, my growing up, vinyl, and we didn't ever have, to my recollection, an 8-track player, but a lot of people did. But we went vinyl to cassette. By the late 60s or around 1970, we had a cassette player at home. We had a unit sitting on a cabinet in our living room that could play LPs or cassettes. And you could record, you could get blank cassettes. That was the other thing. And replacing those little reel-to-reel mini recorders, you could record onto cassette. Yes.
I want to hear more about Snyder and Murphy. Who are these people?
That's probably a conversation. It was little kid characters.
Okay.
That Kathy and I made up.
How old were you
when we did those? We did Snyder and Murphy, probably
12
and 14,
okay.
And maybe even a little bit older. But Kathy, my sister Kathy, was a creative genius. So a lot of the things that you saw come up later on in my adult life, making up song lyrics to existing songs, changing lyrics. Kathy was instrumental. I mean, she and I got those from other sources. Our Aunt Mary Kay was always making up stories and making things up when we were growing up. And so we were influenced by that. But I got a lot of my thought process and creativity about those types of creative things from my older sister. She was my mentor in those things. We would do some of them together. She was often the driver.
She's also the mentor in
Strawberry Alarm Clock, Incense and Peppermints.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much. She was
Snyder and Murphy talked baby talk. That's right.
Okay.
And Jerry's saying her first stereo had a built-in 8-track. So yeah.
Well, I do want to point out that Kathy was also your mentor for learning manners and how to behave.
This is the start of high school. I remember this more specifically than Kathy because I brought it up. But Kathy is 2 years older than I am. So
if we end on this story, I'm good with this. I love this story.
And we're going to probably revisit some of these, topics. Chelan's already said she wants to get further into my upbringing in different ways.
Who are you?
High school years and a variety of things there. But when I started high school, my freshman year, I was very nerdy. I had pictures built into the video that we're not going to be able to share, although you may have seen some of them in the promos this week of my nerdy, geeky, weird little brother. Kathy could very easily, when I started high school, we didn't bus to school, we walked to school. It was a little distance, but it was walkable. We could get there in like probably 20, 25 minutes. Kathy, what's your recollection of walking from home to Adams High School? But we would walk to school, and Kathy, again, was 2 years older than me. She had a lot of, I thought, really cool friends. Her friends, she was involved in choir. She had a little bit of involvement in theater through musical theater and doing the school musical the first year. And I thought her friends were the coolest in the world. And sometimes we would either pick up some of her friends on the way to school, or particularly walking home. We'd walk home in a group. But walking to school early on, beginning of my freshman year, my sister Kathy would start to do things very subtly. She never made this something where she was belittling me or anything else, but have me like move to walk on the outside of the curb. And when we get to the school, she would have me go ahead and open the door for her. And again, she wasn't being bossy about it. It was all very mildly instructive. And I think after some days of doing that, I said, why are you doing this? And her response basically was, you're in high school now. It's not going to be that much longer before you're going to start going out on dates. And I just want to make sure that you know how to properly treat a lady. And I so appreciated that. Now, the other thing that goes with that is that particularly once I started getting involved in choir, I was in the same circles, in the same places that Kathy was for the next 2 years. And trust me, I was very much a weird and nerdy little brother.
I believe it. I trust you. Okay.
And people who know me now and knew me then who are on there will definitely, but Kathy very realistically and appropriately could have said, stay away from me and stay away from I don't want you to pretend like you don't know me. Instead, she included me. She integrated me. Some of her close friends became my close friends. If there was a, get together, a party, it was typically her group. It was her age, 2 years older, her age group. And I was always included and allowed to come along and invited. And I was really embraced by that group of people.
They don't make them like that anymore.
I think they do. I think it depends on the individuals.
Yeah.
But the fact that Kathy did that was a lot of my being able to start maturing and becoming less weird. I was still weird. I was weird for a lot. I still am. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So that was all very instrumental in that. But yeah, I think we're going to have to bring a stop to it here. Thank you I'm glad that you were here in person, so that in spite of the video not running, hopefully we'll be able to share that at some point. There've been some glitchy things going on with our studio platform recently. And, even when we test some of these things, it just, it doesn't always work. So we're going to go ahead and transition. I do want to share a few things that are coming up in the next few weeks, Chelan, that I think you'll appreciate. But next week, so I want to thank you again for doing this and for being here the last couple of weeks to help with this.
Quite welcome, Steve.
Next week, we're going to have on a producer who has produced several Broadway shows, off-Broadway shows, independent shows, many of them in the New York area, by the name of Ananth Das. Ananth is great. You're going to enjoy this conversation, and you're going to enjoy his hair. Yes, I know that's coming up in here. Also, I
wasn't going to say it, but you said it.
Well, it's come up every time I promote this, and it came up when I had the conversation with him that's already been
fantastic
prepared for next week. And then in a couple of weeks out, on the 19th, we're going to have a friend of yours, someone you actually made the introduction for and introduced to me and recommended, Jeff Fiend. We're going to be talking about potato pants.
You'll want to tune in.
Yeah, I'm not even going to tell you why we're talking about potato pants, but you're going to like this conversation.
Potato pants came up, and I said, I need you to talk to my father immediately.
And then going out to July 26th, we're going to have a lady on by the name of Michelle Villalobos. Michelle is an author. She is a public speaker. She's been featured on a number of network television shows. And she's also a coach and an executive coach to a lot of people, business coach. And she's just got a lot of creativity and a lot of, I think, really cool things to share. So you will also want to be here to meet Michelle. It's very engaging, bright, charming, and just informative.
She looks so put together.
She is. It's going to be great. You're going to want to be here. She is what she refers to herself as the superstar activator, and it's part of her mission to help people rise to the next level in the things that they're doing in life. I also want to remind you, we're going to be looking ahead to an opportunity that I'm not going to worry about the double logo up there right now. But we're going to be looking at an opportunity to bring a few people on for an episode who've had either are currently or have had some direct involvement in being part of book clubs. We want to talk about book clubs and how that leads to expanding people's reading and the things that they read and what you like about book clubs and why getting together as a group to read together may be a cool thing. And for some of you, you may go, I liked parts of it, but there were other parts that were kind of weird or whatever it might be. I've never been in a book club.
I've never been in.
I want to understand that. So if you're interested, potentially, if you are or have been in a book club and want to talk about that experience, and can send us that information, just email us again at cbwsteve@comcast.net. Send your name, email address, which will obviously probably be in the information, but put it in the body as well, just so we don't miss it, and a phone number with the subject line book club, so that we can follow up with you, let you know a little bit of what we're talking about. It'll probably be a few weeks down the road because we want to get it all put together, but we would love to feature 3 or 4 of our friends as part of that conversation, part of that episode. What are the topics you'd like to discuss? Who are the guests you'd like to see? We mentioned that Chelan has made introductions, and some of the rest of you have as well. And, maybe it's you. Maybe you're saying, I have a great topic to discuss, or somebody, or you just have some ideas. Send us an email at cbwsteve@comcast.net to share those ideas so that we can get back to you, consider those opportunities, and put them together. 6+ years we've been on the air, Chelan. Wow. This was episode 278. Aren't you feeling thrilled
Ridiculous.
that
I
you were
am
part of
thrilled.
episode 278?
Yes.
146 of our episodes have been with guests, not just me,
Not
but
just
people like you.
like me.
Yes. And 97 individuals have been on one or more times to fill out that 146 episodes. So that's
Now
cool.
with the guests coming up, I think you're going to hit 100 pretty soon.
We are going to hit 100 very, very soon. In fact, we should, by the time we get to the end of this month, have 100 individual guests who have appeared on the show. That's a nice milestone. Did you know that we have a YouTube channel?
What?
Yes, we do. You can find it easily. You go to YouTube and you put in, hey, or you can, ask your AI, hey, where can I find the channel for Coffee Breaks with Steve? Or you can just type it in on the search, Coffee Breaks with Steve, or even CBWS. And you'll find our channel, and you'll see our logo, and you'll find that our videos are out there. There are other things out there that you can find. And that's a good place to go back if you missed an episode and find it. But that's also a channel you can share with your friends, your colleagues, your family members.
Your enemies.
Or you could share it with your enemies because maybe you think, I want them to learn from this particular topic and guest. Yeah. But that's a great place beyond our little circle here around the virtual coffee table.
Jerry, you didn't have to specify. We always take those as compliments.
Oh yeah, no, Jerry's absolutely right. She said geek and earlier in that she was not incorrect. Jerry has known me for a long time. So I take that with a tremendous amount of, I just feel like that's love. Yeah, it's love. All right, listen, we do have to go. We want to thank everyone for being here today, being part of the conversation. You all shared some great and fun things. And yes, we will have to go back and revisit Snyder and Murphy at some point, but I'm just going to leave that one out there. Listen, I'm going to let you say it. We said it on a recording last week. I don't trust recordings today. So I'm just going to let you say it once again. What is it? We know that people all have ways of touching lives around them. So
find a way to make a difference in your world this week. God bless you. See you soon. Have a great week.
Have a great week.
Have a great week.
Bye, everybody.